Our country was founded upon the concept and in the midst of a great boycott. At the time, we were boycotting British goods and most specifically British tea. There's likely nothing more American than to protest, to dissent, and to boycott. In fact, our founding fathers, many of them, including Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, gathered in 1773, dressed as Indians, and dumped 90,000 pounds of British tea into the harbor. Some of our founding fathers were actually involved with trying to smuggle and import Dutch tea to get around the rules, to get around having to be so dependent on England. But this was a boycott. A sad thing today is that we will be debating whether or not to place limitations on the First Amendment right to boycott, and we will do it because the vast majority of this body disagrees with the concept of what the people are boycotting over. I would argue that it doesn't matter what the issue is. In fact, the First Amendment is to protect issues of speech and issues of boycott that you may disagree with. I'm not particularly enamored. In fact, I don't favor the boycott of Israel. I think Israel's been a good ally. And yet, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the freedom to protest, the freedom to boycott is so fundamentally American. How can we give that up so easily? How can we just say, oh, well, it's a good ally, and we don't want anybody boycotting them. We're just going to amend the First Amendment because we don't like this boycott. Our founding fathers would roll over in their grave if they knew what we were doing today. I stand today at Henry Clay's desk. This desk has been passed down to the senator from Kentucky ever since he left the Senate in 1850. But in 1809, when he first arrived here, or actually even before he arrived here, there was a boycott of British goods. In fact, there was an official embargo that Jefferson had put on where we were upset with what the British were doing on the high seas with confiscating our ships, and we decided to have an organized embargo, a boycott. In Kentucky, Henry Clay was still in the state legislature, and he proposed a rule saying that the legislators themselves should not wear British clothing. It was opposed by a guy named Hamilton Marshall, who was a cousin of the Chief Justice, the first Chief Justice, John Marshall. They got into heated words, at which time Henry Clay, wearing his American homespun clothing, was confronted with Hamilton Marshall, who came in wearing what was described as garish English imports. And he called Henry Clay a demagogue for passing this legislation. Well, Henry Clay gave it right back and called him a liar, at which point the words accelerated and they were about to come to blows when a massive 6'6" German-American legislator jumped in between them and stopped the fight from ensuing on the floor. Henry cooled down. Henry Clay decided to apologize. He apologizes to the body and gives his apology, and Marshall jumps up and shouts back, "It is the apology of a poltroon," which is an old-fashioned word for coward. Things didn't get much better after that, and Henry Clay challenged him to a duel. It was illegal and still is illegal to have a duel in Kentucky, so they went across the river in Louisville and fought a duel, at which time Henry Clay was wounded in the thigh. And in those days, even though the laws were against dueling, you were often rewarded for dueling by getting a promotion. And so the state legislature, within a week or two, elected Henry Clay to go to the U.S. Senate to represent them. So not only are boycotts a big part of our history, this particular boycott actually elevated Henry Clay to the U.S. Senate to become one of the most famous senators in our history. Other famous boycotts. There was a boycott of the buses in Montgomery in 1955 and 1956. The boycott went on for 382 days. It was set off, as you'll recall, by Rosa Parks refusing to be seated in the back of the bus. But this boycott was about speech, and it was about law, and it was about justice. Now, people would say, well, I agreed with that boycott. That's okay. It's okay to have good boycotts that I agree with, but it's not okay to have boycotts I disagree with. I will make this argument, that if today this body votes to encourage this idea that legislatively we should penalize people who boycott, I will argue today that guess what? If you can penalize boycotts you disagree with, you may well find someday that people are penalizing boycotts that you agree with. If you have the power to disallow boycotts you don't like, you're now granting to the government the power to ban boycotts that you may well like. And the thing is should the majority get to decide, well, that's a good boycott and that's a bad boycott, and you can say certain types of speech as long as I agree with you? No, the freedom of speech, the First Amendment, is about allowing language you don't like. It's about allowing boycotts you may not like. But if you go through our history is replete with boycotts, from the Boston Tea Party to the boycott around the War of 1812 of British goods, to the bus boycott in Montgomery. Boycott after boycott. It's a fundamental aspect of the First Amendment. You don't believe me? Listen to the Supreme Court. In NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, blacks were protesting a whites-only store that wouldn't allow service or allow sales to blacks. They boycotted the store, and guess what? The Supreme Court said 8-0 that you can boycott, particularly if your boycott is based on speech. It's based on a political viewpoint. Now, while I don't agree with people who want to boycott Israel, if you live in our country or wherever you live and you don't like their policies, do you not have a right to boycott? Do we somehow going to take away your right to boycott because we disagree with what you're boycotting over? I got a short list here of a few different things that we've boycotted over, and they range, interestingly, on both sides of the coin. Most recently, people on the left who don't like President Trump have boycotted Ivanka Trump's fashion brand. A year or two ago, Christians boycotted Disney over what they considered to be liberal movies, or movies they didn't appreciate, the families depicted. In North Carolina, liberals boycotted the North Carolina transgender bathroom law. People have boycotted Chick-fil-A because a CEO was opposed to same-sex marriage. The Dixie Chicks criticized George W. Bush. They were boycotted. It doesn't matter whether you agree with any of these boycotts. Boycotts are speech. How could we possibly boycott someone's speech? But that's what's going on. About 20 states have passed these laws, and what we're now considering before our body is putting our imprimatur, our stamp of approval, we are going to put on these states that are penalizing boycotts. So who are some of the people that we're going to penalize? In Texas, there's a speech pathologist who's lost her job. She was working for the school system. She's been in this country 30 years. Her name is Bahia Amawe. She's been here 30 years. She's a U.S. citizen. She speaks 3 languages. She works with children with autism, disabilities, and speech impediments. Her contract was not renewed because they told her she had to sign a pledge that she will not boycott Israel, and she also had to sign a pledge that she would never do anything economically or refrain from any action, buying a product, from anyone who does business in Israel or does business in an area they called the Israeli-controlled territory. So there's been a dispute for 30 or 40 years over the West Bank, whether the Palestinians should have more autonomy, whether it should be a country, whether it should be a province of Israel, whether they should vote, whether they should not vote. This is a political debate. This woman has an opinion that she doesn't want to sign this pledge. She no longer works. We heard on the floor from one of my colleagues yesterday, he said, well, it's the government's money. The government's money shouldn't be used to allow a boycott. Well, if you're a teacher and you get a salary, is that still the government's money after you've done your job and you have your paycheck? Should a teacher be prevented from boycotting or expressing their speech through an economic action, or really through an economic inaction by not buying something? It's a whole idea of not. A boycott is not even do anything. A boycott is refusing to buy someone's product. How could we possibly be in favor of that? How could we have such clouded judgment that this body that has such historic importance is going to vote to place a ban on freedom of speech? How could that possibly happen in our country? This woman's been denied her job. It's her main job. She works for the school district. She had a contract. Her contract has been denied because she refuses to sign a pledge saying she won't not buy a product from somebody that she disagrees with politically. How did we get here? How could we possibly even be considering such absurd limitations on the First Amendment? This one's even worse. In Arkansas, the newspaper, the Arkansas Times, routinely takes ads. That's how newspapers make money. One of the groups that advertises with them is the state university. The state university will no longer advertise with this newspaper unless they fine them first or give them some kind of penalty. They will not advertise with them unless the newspaper signs a statement saying that they will not be critical of policies in Israel. How could we possibly say to a newspaper that you can't do business with the state if you criticize a policy in Israel? How could that possibly be the American way? But the vast majority of the people here, like sheep, will fall all over themselves today to vote to try to limit your right to boycott. You know, people say you don't have a right to a job, but what if you're with the state? What if you're a teacher and that's who you've always worked for? You've worked for the government. Can we start placing rules because the government pays you on what your political viewpoint is? Arkansas says, well, the newspaper can do it, but they would have to have a 20% penalty. So if you have certain viewpoints or you refuse to bow down to the government and bow down to the opinion the government tells you is appropriate, we'll let you work for the government, but you get penalized 20%. Imagine when this becomes another view, when this becomes some other issue that you're interested in. Probably the most famous boycott in recent history, other than the Montgomery bus boycott over segregation, was the anti-apartheid, the anti-apartheid boycott that ultimately led to a change of government and a change of policy. This wasn't done with automatic weapons. This wasn't done with tanks. This wasn't done with planes and bombs. It was done by good old-fashioned protest, peaceful protest, by agreeing not to buy something. Can you imagine the state is putting in place laws that punish you for not buying something, for refusing to buy something from someone? It's galling. So will this be declared unconstitutional? Nobody knows for sure other than the men and women of the Supreme Court. But in Claiborne, in the NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, 8-0, they said it's unconstitutional to ban or limit any kind of boycott if that boycott is about speech or political views. Well, clearly, that's what this is about, political views. So 2 of the states that have passed these laws, in Kansas and in Arizona, there's already been protests and there's been court cases. So in Kansas, there's a woman by the name of Esther Kuntz. She's a Mennonite and a math teacher. She's been a math teacher for about a decade. She has a contract with the school system to teach other teachers about teaching math and science. She said she couldn't, in good conscience, sign a pledge saying that she would never boycott any group that originated out of Israel. So what happened to her? She was fired, or she couldn't continue in the job she had been with for, I think, a decade. Her case went to court, and guess what? The court said it's unconstitutional. You cannot limit behavior. You cannot limit employment with the government based on one's political views. So the first challenge has struck it down as unconstitutional. We go to Arizona. Michael Jordahl, for political reasons, boycotts consumer goods made in Israel. It's America. You don't have to agree with what he's doing, but in America, you have the right to protest. You have the right to boycott. So for 12 years, he's been doing the legal services for the local county jail. They brought him his contract, and in his contract, they said, you have to pledge that you will no longer support any activities that agree with your political viewpoint, that you don't like the policy of Israel. He went to court, and guess what the court said? The law is unconstitutional. So this court has gone twice. These laws have gone twice to federal court, once in Kansas and once in Arizona, have been struck down. So what is this august body going to do? We're going to take it right up, and we're going to say, by golly, keep passing these unconstitutional laws in the states. We got your back. It's already been struck down twice by 2 federal district courts. The Supreme Court has said the concept of limiting boycotts is unconstitutional. The First Amendment says that Congress can't pass a law limiting speech, and here we are going to pass a law encouraging the limitation of speech. One of the famous boycotts was obviously the Montgomery bus boycott. The anti-apartheid boycotts were famous as well. But even if you go farther back in our history, about the time of the Boston Tea Party and beyond, another boycott, you find that people were boycotting the slave trade. There were people boycotting buying sugar out of the Caribbean because they didn't want to have any of that money go to supporting the slave trade. I would argue that the right to boycott is about as fundamental a right as we have in America. It's a big part of the First Amendment. It's an important part of the First Amendment. But it is a fundamental aspect of freedom to be able to dissent, to protest. Even when everybody thinks you're wrong, that's what America's about, that you have the right to protest, that the government will not squelch your speech. How did we get to this point where flippantly today we are going to encourage states to have limitations on the First Amendment? I don't know how we got here. When we look at the First Amendment, and some will say, well, you know, this is just the state government. We're just, allowing states' rights. Well, here's the thing about states' rights. Ever since the Civil Rights era, we have decided that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. The 14th Amendment, going all the way back to the time of the Civil War, incorporated the First Amendment. Many of the boycotts have actually been in favor of civil rights. Now, just because this one is a boycott about something else that you may or may not like or may not support, doesn't mean that we should place limitations on it. If we begin to do this, it is a road that some may say is paved with good intentions. We're headed towards a time where speech will be regulated by your government, where the idea of dissent, the idea of protest, will be judged on whether or not people think, or the majority of the body thinks, that the protest is in order, whether the majority of the body thinks that you should be allowed to protest. How un-American. I can't think of anything more un-American than trying to limit the ideas and actions of a boycott. I remember when I was in college, the women of the Southwestern Baptist Convention decided they didn't like pornographic magazines out in the open where kids could see them. They didn't even ask the legislature for a law. They actually did, which I think is even better than asking the legislation for a law. They just simply went and marched out in front of all the convenience stores. They did it for about a month, and guess what? Convenience stores decided they didn't like people protesting, they didn't like everybody talking about them, so they put the magazines behind the counter. That is the American way. Nobody forced them to do it, actually. They did it under public protest. They did it under public pressure. The idea that we are going to pass a law today that says to the states, oh, we like the First Amendment, but if we don't like what you're saying, we don't like what you're protesting, it's okay to punish these people. It's okay to say to the woman in Texas who feels very strongly about this issue in Israel that she can't be employed anymore by the school district because of her political point of view. I can't imagine that this isn't going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware was unanimous, 8-0. How did we get here? I would say that I hope that my colleagues will listen to the debate, or that there will be a spirited debate over the First Amendment, but don't hold your breath. You can see there's no one here other than myself. They won't listen. The hope is that the American people will listen and say, how did we vote to send people to Washington who are so careless with the Constitution that they're willing to vote to ban boycotting? They're willing to vote for something that's already been struck down by 2 federal district courts, something that's already been ruled on by the U.S. Supreme Court, and they're going to go ahead and vote anyway because they don't like this particular boycott. the First Amendment isn't about popular speech. The First Amendment is about protecting unpopular speech. So my hope is that somewhere across America, people are listening, and they will call their representatives today, call their senators and say, how could you? How dare you take the First Amendment, crumple it up, and say, oh, we're going to today limit the First Amendment to only boycotts we approve of. We're going to limit it to speech that we approve of. What a disgrace. What a terrible day in our history that we're going to take the First Amendment, crumple it up, stomp on it, and simply say, oh, we're afraid of that speech, and so we're going to ban it. I think it has the opposite effect. I think it only encourages the protest. And what I would say to my colleagues is, think long and hard today before you vote to place limitations on the First Amendment.
The first time.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, in a few moments, the Senate will vote on S1, the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act. This legislation contains several important bills to enhance defense cooperation with our partners who share the goal of fighting terrorism and promoting peace and prosperity. For example, the bill includes the United States-Jordan Defense Cooperation Extension Act, which extends an existing defense cooperation program with Jordan that is set to expire later this year. This morning, in the Senate Armed Services Committee, we heard from the commander of U.S. Central Command responsible for the Middle East, General Joseph Votel. He testified that, and I quote, "Jordan is one of our most committed partners in the Middle East and one of the most critical voices of modern Islam in the region. We must be careful to not take this vital partnership for granted." Jordan hosts over 750,000 refugees and contributes to the fight against ISIS. This bill will enhance our cooperation while enhancing security and supporting vital humanitarian efforts being conducted by this very important American ally. The legislation also includes the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act. This bill is named after a Syrian army defector who exposed photographs of torture and execution by the Syrian regime. His photos are evidence of the war crimes and extensive human rights abuses committed by Bashar al-Assad. The Caesar bill will impose sanctions on individuals who support Assad. These sanctions will limit the ability of the Assad government to attack innocent civilians. However, the bill before us is not perfect, and I'm concerned by Title IV of this package, and Title IV should have had a full debate in the Banking Committee before it ever reached the floor. I believe there are serious questions about how this bill will impact the First Amendment rights of individuals who contract with state or local government in a professional capacity, but choose to boycott Israel in their personal capacity. These questions are even more complicated when the individual in question is a sole proprietor, a member of a small firm, or is receiving a small state contract. Many of these questions are the result of the manner in which state and local governments have designed and implemented disclosure requirements. And that is why I have introduced an amendment, Peters 103, which would limit application of state and local government laws related to contracting. This amendment would not allow a state or local government to enforce measures to restrict contracting with firms of 10 or fewer employees, contracts with a value of $100,000 or less, or any contract that is a sole proprietor. This amendment would clarify that it is not the intention of the bill to restrict the First Amendment right to protest, including through boycott, of any individual in their personal capacity. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment, that amendment number 103 be reported by number, and the amendment be agreed to without intervening action or debate.
Madam President.
The senator from Idaho.
Madam President, reserving the right to object. First of all, I want to agree with my distinguished colleague and friend from Michigan as to most everything he said, with the exception of Article 4. This BDS provision is a really, really important provision, and I understand what he is attempting to do with the exemption, as I understand it, that he's putting in for the small businesses. But having said that, we really believe that this should apply across the board, and once we start the exempting process, it's going to be very difficult to stop. So, given that, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President? Madam President, I'm incredibly disappointed that we could not include my amendment here today. I believe this is an important issue and that it must be clarified. Ultimately, because of the many other critical provisions included in this bill related to foreign policy in the Middle East, I will support this bill today. But I also understand that it's unlikely the House of Representatives will address this bill in its current form. And I'm sending a letter to the House of Representatives explaining my concerns with Title IV, and I encourage them to adopt the provisions of my amendment that I attempted to put forward here today. And with that, I'd also like to yield some time to my colleague from Michigan.
Madam President, I'm very proud to be a co-sponsor of the Peters amendment as well as other amendments that Senator Peters has put forward, and thank him very much for his leadership. To me, this is common sense. I'm very disappointed that this will not be included in this bill, and I will join Senator Peters in advocating in the House for this clarification and other changes that will make it very, very clear about an individual's right to be able to have freedom of speech in all of its forms. And it is very unfortunate today we could not have adopted this common sense approach and made this bill, I think, stronger than it is now. So thank you, Senator Peters, for his hard work on this.
Madam President, I yield the floor.
Mr. Schumer, aye.
The ayes are 77, the nays are 23. The bill as amended is passed.